In the studio now to discuss the impact of the war on Eastern Europe and Russia is Tarik Cyril Amar, a historian and professor from Koch University. Thank you for joining me today. Let's first talk about the chronology of the war. We commemorate certain events throughout the year, such as today, the 100th anniversary of the armistice. But some would say that the war did not actually end today, that it in fact dragged out for years.
Yes, I would think that that is absolutely right. In some way, it ended today between some of the major powers which were at war. But in other ways, if you look at the global map, in Eastern Europe, it drags on for years in a mixture of war and civil war quite often. And you find further conflicts that are at least linked to the First World War, the Great War, of course. And if you factor them in, you have, for instance, the conflict in Ireland, between the UK and Ireland, if you want. You have the Greek-Turkish War, of course, itself. You could even see the Ruhr occupation in post-war Germany as a long drawn-out end of the war after the war. So yes, in many ways, it is more realistic, perhaps, historically, to speak of a later end of the war. It takes time to settle, as it were.
We talk a lot about the Western Front and a lot of these commemorative events taking place in France and how the war impacted Europe. But talk to us about how it impacted the world more on a global scale.
I think the first point I would stress here is that it brings to an end, or at least it massively disrupts, a first age of modern globalization that has actually happened before the war. It also, of course, affects areas far beyond Europe. There's the whole British Empire, of course, we know that. But there's also, if you only think about the people who are on the battlefields, either as combatants or as laborers, it affects hundreds of thousands from Africa. It affects many, many Chinese who are brought in quite often to work, but in the context of the war. And you could add further examples. The war is actually truly global. And the way in which we have often focused on it as a history of nation states in Europe is, of course, not incorrect, but it only reflects a part of its reality and its effects.
Let's talk about the relationship between civilians and military. Tens of millions of people died, but not just soldiers.
No, not at all. Even if you exclude the Spanish flu, the Spanish influenza that marks the end or the aftermath of the war, you still find that among the more or less 40 million who are killed in conjunction with this war, about half are actually civilians. That, of course, is a very rough indicator, but it already shows you what this war does. It has a special capacity to mobilize and bring, as it were, into the conflict civilian populations, but also, of course, not only as workers and those on the home front, but as targets.
All right, Tarik Cyril Amar, thank you for joining us today and shedding some light on this.
Thank you very much. Okay.